Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it's kind of weird to realize it's been a week since I posted the previous episode, because that one was from a hotel room in San Diego, and it either feels like a day or two ago or a month. Everything's still a blur. The trip back to New Jersey that night was a little fraught. We beat the 11:30 p.m. curfew for takeoffs in San Diego by 4 minutes. That was something. A couple of flight delays and a really quick boarding process. And anyway, I spent the next day plus recovering from the red eye and the overall experience of getting out and traveling again. I've tested negative twice since then, so still feeling good. Now, Friday evening, I had a client dinner in New York City at this wonderful restaurant, but it was indoors and, of course, maskless, and I was a little uptight about that, too. But between that and the plane flights and everything, I did okay and had a fantastic dinner out of the whole deal. So I don't have any business travel until September, but I do have to start planning to host my own in-person conference in October in Maryland, having signed the sales agreement yesterday with the hotel. We held the event virtually for the past 2 years, and I really can't justify doing that again, given how the other big trade shows have gone lately. So planning for that's going to occupy some of my summer into fall. Doesn't mean I'm going to miss any episodes of the show. I mean, I may, but it won't be because of the conference. It'll just be my overall sense of burned outness and frazzledness, I guess. Or maybe it'll be just another stage of my midlife crisis, which brings us to this week's show. See, my guest this time is Andrew Jamieson, author of the new book, Midlife, Humanity's Secret Weapon, from Notting Hill Editions, distributed in the U.S. by New York Review Books. Andrew is a psychotherapist in the UK, and Midlife is a wonderful little book about what midlife crises are and how they can lead to a flowering of people's lives in their second half, and sort of how that flowering can collectively help mankind survive the collective midlife crisis we're going through as a civilization, which I know is kind of a broad and overarching thing, but we'll focus on the micro level first. I love the book, and admittedly, I am a target demographic for it, 51, this stage of my life, the leukemia diagnosis and all that stuff, looking back at what I've done, what's ahead of me, etc. Andrew, though, does a wonderful job in the book of exploring the roots of the midlife crisis and tying our understanding of it to these key developments in the lives of Freud and Jung. And from there, he explores a couple of key figures in modern history and how their midlife crises led to greater achievements, both on a personal level and for the good of humanity. And he does a great job of threading that personal and universal, or the micro and macro versions of what we're living through. And of course, as someone in that midlife demographic facing a number of big changes in recent years, I went pretty deep in this book and seeing how Andrew's explanations and history and examples could help me try to navigate things. Like I say numerous times in our conversation, I've never been in therapy. I'm not saying that in any sort of derisive way against therapy, more about myself. Clearly, I'd have benefited. But seeing my own lifelong patterns of behavior in recent years, which we talk about in this, and then reading Midlife and seeing how similar patterns affected other people and how they either triumphed over them or at least short-circuited them enough to move forward in their own lives, gave me some optimism about whatever the heck it is I'm doing nowadays. Now, Midlife is only about 140 pages. There's these really gorgeous little hardcover editions that Notting Hill does. But there's an awful lot in this book. Andrew is very economical with his prose. Brings in not just, again, that history and these historic examples, but some of his own experience at key moments, sort of becoming a little like Virgil to guide us through this part of our lives. And he focuses, or his theory, I guess, is centered on Jung's psychology and his theory of individuation. I just don't know enough about all that to critique, but the way he frames it all sure seems like a good route. So I came out of reading Midlife and this conversation with Andrew really charged up and ready to focus on some creative work that I'd let fall by the wayside in the last year or two, or you could say my entire life. I mean, even when my focus started to flag in the wake of that, as it inevitably does for me because of reasons, I've been able to kind of realign myself and restart and not fall into some of that repetitive neurotic behavior of mine, which is a chunk of what we talk about, that tension between Freud and Jung and what they think the role of the therapist is, and we'll say whether mankind, or at least individual people, can improve, can get past some of the neuroses that they have. As Andrew says very late in this conversation, God, I'd love to have you for a client, Gil. And it's pretty obvious I could use help. But anyway, what I'm saying is Midlife's a good book, and it may open your eyes to the positives that can come from this phase of life. Also, let me tell you something. During the trade show last week, when I was out in San Diego, I got to catch up with this work pal, a guy I hadn't seen since the before time. I knew he'd had a rough near-death experience with COVID. A mutual pal filled me in on that, and that he had gotten divorced sometime during this phase. I can't remember if it was before the COVID case or after, but anyway, my pal's around 60, and we got together and talked at his company's booth, and he told me he's never been happier, having made it through both of those experiences. And he looked great. He's dropped like 30 or 40 pounds, but that's secondary. That's a standard midlife thing. It's what I did when I had my matter of fact, I had my big relationship meltdown 20 years ago, the weekend before this trade show, and I was, as part of that, ended up losing a ton of weight and becoming a different guy for a year and a half before I met Amy and found the true love of my life. But anyway, what I'm saying is my pal, he was a different person. He was a better person, it felt like, from our conversation at the booth. He's happier because he'd found someone he loves, and he's in a new relationship. But it's not just that. It's not that codependent thing. What seemed different was even his tone of voice, that was very distinct from the pre-pandemic version of him and who he is now. And he somehow seemed more solicitous when we talked, and more engaged with really hearing what I had to say, and at the same time really speaking from his heart, not just offering platitudes and not just waiting for me to stop talking. It was it told me a lot that, he said, it bums me out that I had to get to 60 something before having this new life, but at least I've got it. So it's not that Andrew or I are saying you need to go through ICU and a divorce, etc., to find your better self, but it's that notion that the better self is out there, or in here. You know what I mean. Anyway, here's Andrew's bio from the book. Andrew Jamieson trained at the Bath Center for Psychotherapy and Counseling and received an MA in Humanistic and Integrative Psychotherapy at Middlesex University. He lectures and writes articles on a series of subjects, including psychotherapy's interconnection with philosophy, music, and literature. Parallel to his psychotherapeutic career, he has promoted orchestral concerts throughout the UK for over 40 years. We talk about that too. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Andrew Jamieson. tell me about the origin of midlife as a book, and then we'll talk about the origins of our respective midlife crises later on.
Yes. Well, I suppose in my case, it goes back to a midlife crisis. I'm 71 now, and when I was 47, we had a very nice surprise. We had our third daughter, and it was a very busy time of my professional life. I was running my business and charging about the place, and both my parents had health issues, and the combination of these three things in the course of a couple of years, by the time I was about 49, I was desperately tired. And Jung said that exhaustion can be a great window into the unconscious. In my case, it certainly was. And just one day I couldn't get out of bed. And I remained in bed for about 2 to 3 months. And the highlight of my day, feeling very miserable for myself and wondering whether I'd ever find sufficient energy to do anything again, the highlight of my day was talking to my wonderful therapist, Hella Adler, each day. She was a marvelous woman of 92 who'd been analyzed by Jung in Zurich as a younger woman and was married to Jung's great editor, Gerhard Adler, who'd edited all the collected works. So it was a very introverted few months. And during the period of that sort of collapse, that was when I formulated the idea that I wanted to become very belatedly a therapist, because the training takes a long time. And then I started my training soon after recovering, and alongside running my business, which I continue to run as parallel careers today. It took me 8 years, and I took an MA, a master's degree at the same time, and my master's dissertation was on the midlife crisis. And then a friend of mine sent I do a fair amount of lecturing, and she sent some of my essays and lectures to this publisher, Notting Hill Editions. And I never thought that they'd ever respond. And about a year later, I got a telephone call out of the blue saying they'd like me to write a book on the midlife crisis. And that's what happened. And I had a very pleasant second year of the pandemic when we were locked down, enjoying myself tremendously writing this book and using all the material. I had lots of dreams and diaries and poems that I'd kept during this 3 or 4 month hiatus. And it's taken me by surprise, this sudden new activity of becoming an author. So
how did it differ from either from papers you had worked on, or just sort of integrating the lessons of work?
As soon as I was asked to do this, they said we'd like this to come out at the end of the year, which was quite a challenge in terms of the timeline, and but they wanted a title within the next fortnight because they were going to advertise their forward editions, and I gave them 10 titles. They didn't like any of them. And so I gave them another 10 titles, which they found equally uncongenial. And then they came up with the title, Midlife, Humanity's Secret Weapon, because I've talked about it within the essay as it being part of our evolutionary process. And that was a marvelous title. That was far better than my 20 titles. And it gave me a certain challenge that I had to see it as a kind of species psychological event as well as an individual psychological event. And that was what gave it a little bit of originality and interest. The fact that and the more I've thought about it, the more I think the macro and the micro experience are very similar. And I end the book saying that I think we, as a species, we've started the midlife crisis in 1914, which will probably last 200 years. And certainly at the moment, it's at full spate with pandemics and European wars, which we thought we'd never have again. So
maybe 200 years is optimistic.
Well, maybe 200 years was optimistic. And of course, when you think the first, I think it was the first cellular animal that appeared on the planet was 4 billion years ago, and we appeared about 50,000, 60,000 years ago as a civilization. So we're a very, very new creature. And
yet, oh, go on.
And well, one wonders whether we've had. Basically, the book says that we are in this midlife crisis is about dealing with species extinction events. Firstly, a nuclear war, and I use the Cuban Missile Crisis as, my God, we came close to a nuclear annihilation in that period, and then of course global warming. And if we get over that and we survive what we're doing to the planet at the moment, I think artificial intelligence is going to be the next great challenge. As we're on an extraordinary parabolic curve in terms of the development of artificial intelligence. So it's going to be very challenging, I think, the next period, but it could be wonderful. I mean, there are crisis and opportunity, they always go hand in hand. The Chinese have the same pictogram as in crisis as an opportunity, and it's true.
What do you think becoming a psychotherapist later in life meant for you?
Well,
do you think you could have done the same if you had taken it out of university?
I don't think anybody should really train before the age of 40. I mean, you do need a degree of lifetime experience. There are some people who train in their 20s, and I think that's far too early. I actually don't.
Yesterday's podcast mentioned studying the Zohar and Kabbalah in college, and technically you're not supposed to do that until you're 40 or you go insane,
well, yes.
According to the old rabbis. But
Exactly. I mean, we're talking about eldership, really. That's what the midlife crisis is about. It hopefully creates sufficient cadre of elders who can, as it were, restrain the warriors of the tribe, the high testosterone, belligerent warriors, and we need people like Mandela and Gandhi. And in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was really Adlai Stevenson who provided the eldership that stopped people like dreadful Curtis LeMay wanting to trying to persuade the Kennedy brothers to consider a preemptive nuclear strike against the Russians, which he proposed to Robert Kennedy. So. And they very nearly won the argument in those 13 days in October 1962, and it was really Adlai Stevenson who moved the argument away from the military option of invasion and bombing Cuba. And what we've subsequently heard is that the Russian artillery, which would have met the American Marines as they invaded, had nuclear shells. They were already in Cuba, and that would have started a proliferation of the nuclear escalation. So,
yeah, my parents tell the story, or at least my mother does, of that feeling like the closest to the end of the world. Yes. She was 21, I guess, at the time. But,
yes, well, it's and I remember too. I was at a boarding school, age 9, and we were told that we might be woken in the middle of the night, and if that happened, we had to rush down to the basement as quickly as possible. But I mean, that would have been a pointless gesture.
We used to have all the air raid drills and everything. We're supposed to hide inside our lockers and all that, which I guess was just a way to maybe save something identifiable afterwards. But
I mean, we thought we were over that particular potential species extinction event, and today we had the British on the television earlier this morning. We had the British, the Russian ambassador in London being interviewed, and he was asked whether there was any chance of a nuclear strike, and he tried to be reassuring, but I mean, I don't think. I mean, we were talking about tactical nuclear exchange in Ukraine, but it seems impossible. It seems unbelievable that could happen. But Putin is driven by deep paranoia, and you wonder what he's capable of.
Well, based on some of the book's thesis on upbringing and childhood, etc. Things can be rather unpredictable for people who came up in extremely chaotic times in history and situations.
The trouble is that from 1914 really onwards, the traumatic experience of all Russians, I mean, going through the First World War, then the Russian Revolution, 10 million people died in the Russian Civil War, we forget that. And then the Great Famine of the late 20s, 14 million people died. And then the Stalinist purges took away another 8 million. And then 28 million died in the Second World War. And then more Stalinist purges. So they lived in a perpetual state of trauma, the entire Russian population. And so in terms of the neurology of that experience, I mentioned in the book the relationship between the amygdala and the hippocampus. Continual adrenaline drenching of the hippocampus, which is supposed to control the flight and fight response, has a terrible impact on feelings of well-being and serotonin and dopamine levels that give you a feeling that you live in a safe environment. 45% of my business until 2 years ago was with the Russians, and I used to go to Russia every year, and I love the Russians dearly, but they live in a constant state of imminent catastrophe. It is catastrophe, they say the whole time. And they've had the most terrible history. And interestingly, I mean, the Germans, of course, too, from 1914, really right until the end of the Second World War, that 30 years, with the same sense of trauma. But interestingly, the people like Bert Hellinger, the great psychotherapeutic originator in Germany, they've had a fantastic response to mental illness. And if you, on the National Health Service in Germany, you can pick up 360 hours of psychotherapy free on the state. And the provision of psychotherapy and refuges for people who've got mental health difficulties has made a tremendous difference in Germany. Whereas in Russia, all that trauma has been met by, they see any kind of psychotherapy as a sign of personal weakness, and there's very little psychotherapy that takes place in Russia. Sure. So that paranoia has never been dealt with. We now know there's a thing called epigenetics. Have you come across that?
Well, I was going to talk about that notion of hereditary trauma.
Yeah,
that carries
we
through
now know
because
that the genetic sequencing gets what's called methylated by cortisol, which is the product produced by adrenaline, and that methylation goes on into the next generation. So you've not only got an environmental transmission between the generations, but you've also got a DNA transmission. And so it's not surprising the Russians are as paranoid and frightened as they think that as they are, and how that converts into a kind of high level of aggressive behavior. And of course, they say that Putin at the moment is on a huge dose of steroids because of blood cancer, and that increases.
Yeah, but you never know with all the psyops and disinformation that comes out about this. I mean, those things are interesting to read, but it's like
you think we've got that wrong, that he's not really ill.
You just don't know.
You don't know.
This is the fog of information war as opposed to the fog of war.
And it goes both ways. I mean, obviously, we procrastinate and put forward a sort of different reality that might not be the case. So you're right.
Yeah. But it's all things that help us try to build a narrative and a story that makes sense around this all. But tell me, when you go from the species level back down to the personal one, talk a little about the I would say the theory you put in place for this, the notion of, Freud's notion of repetition versus Jung's individuation, and how they kind of come to a head in midlife and what it means for us.
Well, really, the two approaches to psychotherapy came out of the two books that Jung and Freud both had midlife crises between the ages of between 1913 and 1920, and they both produced in 20 and 21 Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Psychological Types, Jung's book. And in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud said basically, I got it wrong. This is what happens in the midlife crisis. Something called an enantiodromia takes place, and you totally change your position to the opposing polar opposite. And he said, I got it wrong about sexuality. isn't sexuality that's the main drive in human beings. It's actually our propensity to repeat patterns of behavior constantly. That we are drawn to the familiar. We're very conservative in our developmental process. We want to stay much the same. And even though the behavior patterns that we repeat may be to our disadvantage, we still prefer them to something that's more benign and benevolent. And he's very explicit in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, gives examples, and I think he's probably right. I think the clinical experience that we have as psychotherapists, talking to colleagues, is that our clients arrive and they've been repeating the same neurotic replicating experience that repeat the problems that were articulated first in the very earliest months of their life. And certainly looking back, that's something I did, and I can't think of a single client I've had over 15 years practice that hasn't done that. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to break free of this desire to remain in familiar experiential waters. And so that's the Freudian approach. And what Freud says is we're stuck with this repetition compulsion. And all psychotherapists can do is soothe us. It's a kind of Sisyphus's rock that we're pushing up throughout our life. And we're stuck with this condition. And we can find, as it were, strategies to ameliorate the symptom, sort of provide symptom relief. But we're not going to find a cure. Jung took a very different view. He said that within the psyche is a process he called individuation, which is that we live to develop psychologically. And that's would be a good evolutionary model. I mean, the idea that we want to improve our lives, make them more satisfactory and rewarding, that we want to break out of our neuroses and complexes that cause repeated patterns of dysfunctionality. I think Jung's right, but I think Freud is right too, that Freud diagnosed our condition extremely well, but he kind of left us there, whereas Jung gives us a way out. He says, through the process of what he called the Anvil of Crisis, these developmental periods in life, there is one that happens in the late 20s, very common, and then there's the big one that happens in the 40s and 50s, and then there's another developmental phase that happens in the late 50s, early 60s, which the great American psychotherapist, therapeutic theorist Heinz Kohut talked about, where there's a kind of, not a midlife crisis, but a kind of a moment where we put our achievements in our life up to the light and compare them with the blueprint we had when we were in our 20s and see how well we've done compared to that blueprint. And that because we've got perhaps 10 years of the energy and opportunity to put these things right finally. And I find I get a lot of people in their late 50s who come, and if they deal with their problems, the 60s can be a wonderful decade of development. But having said that, the big developmental time is when you hit the midlife crisis, and it probably takes a few years to get through it. But the developmental change, it is, as I say in the book, it's not the timing of the midlife crisis, it's the transformational impact of the midlife crisis that's so significant. So, I mean, Beethoven had his midlife crisis when he was 32, when he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is a kind of mission statement and suicide note, and sort of he had to come to terms with his deafness, which was the most terrible thing for a composer of his quality to suffer from. He was never going to hear his late compositions, and that terrible challenge, that awful affliction, resulted in, undoubtedly some of the greatest music we've ever had, some of the greatest cultural achievement. But it came out of that terrible affliction, and that's what the midlife crisis does. And in the book, I use Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had massive midlife crises, and it turned them into two of the greatest presidents we've had, who made a tremendous contribution to our ethical advancement and at times of great national crisis in the States.
Now, when you talk, though, about again, that idea of Jung, we'll say superseding or helping fix Freud's static condition, I guess, of leaving us trapped. Was that a progression you needed to go through learning? Or is it something that's, a thing in psychotherapeutic circles? I just don't know how accepted or not accepted any of that stuff is.
There are
nowadays.
Definitely two schools of psychotherapy, and generically, and then there are a lot of sub-schools by different theorists, and some believe that we're only there to deal with symptoms. And that's what counselling does. We don't have the trouble about cure, as it were. And what I mean by cure is overcoming the impact of our complexes and our neuroses that stop us, providing us with experience that is to our disadvantage. To do that takes years. It's expensive, but it's probably, in my case, it took 18 years and the job wasn't finished. I mean, in a sense, individuation is a lifetime's progress that goes on till the day you die. I mean, and that's Jung is the great optimist in psychotherapeutic theory, whereas Freud's really the pessimist, and that's why I'm so drawn to Jung, because he says that you literally reach your best in terms of the inner state of being at the end of your life, because you're constantly chipping away at the complexes and reaching towards the finer parts of your nature, what Lincoln called the better angels of our true nature. And I think he's right.
See, this whole time I've managed, never, although I need it desperately, never gone into therapy. I had the realization when I quit my job and launched my new self-run thing back in 2014 that, I discovered a pattern of behavior that I had evinced for decades without realizing it, only in its absence. And it was one of those moments, oh, thank God. I mean, had I got into therapy, I probably would have noticed this this would have been observed far earlier. But it's just the...
Yes, but the Greeks have the ancient Greeks had a theory of kairos, Kairos, and it means the appropriate time, almost the sacred time. In my case, I've wanted to write and become an author all my life. It's only happened to me when I'm 71. I mean, because I simply had to wait. There was other things to be done. I think these things are providentially timed. There is a thing, I think kairos is something that works, that if we try and do something too earlier in our developmental curve, it won't work. I've tried to publish a number of books with tremendous sort of drive and push, and it's never worked. This came out of the blue. I didn't make any attempt at all, and I've had to wait this long. In your case, I suspect you had to wait. I mean, what you've stumbled upon is extraordinary. I heard your Clive James interview. I mean, you're an absolute brilliant born interviewer, and
thank you.
I don't know. In a way,
I like to think there are things I had to learn.
Well, of course there are, but perhaps if you find the thing about therapy is it only works if you find somebody where there's reciprocated devotion. I wrote a paper that seemed to me one of the most. It was called Therapeutic Love, and I think in many ways therapy only works if there's a kind of reciprocated love between the two people. It's a kind of reparenting. So it's got nothing to do with what technique you choose. It's the sheer alchemy of the experience. And if you find the right person, it's the most marvelous experience.
Now, you see, the irony is, the thing I discovered was that because of my neglectful and absent father, I'd spent my entire life both courting and trying to be punished by paternal figures.
Yeah. And I've noticed,
and it was only when I was on my own and didn't have a boss anymore that it finally hit me that, holy crap, I'm responsible for myself. There is no father figure anymore. I have to do this.
Well, that you are,
Yeah.
but you need somebody who can provide a kind of mentorship. I mean, I find what's clear, having talked to you, you've got great personal charm. And I notice that when there's been a deficient amount of parenting, normally that often develops a great personal charm in the individual concerned because they're constantly looking for surrogate parents. And I find so many of my clients are delightful people because they're trying to recruit. They when they come for their first, they there's a sort of connection and they want to please you and I think that's what we do as a child. I mean, did you have other surrogate fathers throughout your childhood and early adulthood? Men who
not really childhood. It was much more, once I got into adult life, that everything became a courtship and confrontation with male authority figures over the course of my life. But you're also right about the attempting to charm every guest I talk to.
Yes,
and the anxiety that goes into every call so that they won't see
it's very natural. It's not staged. It's not fabricated. It's a natural charm and empathy, which you learn early when you've been, as it were, rejected by your parents or one of your parents in a particular way. But have you found? Do you find that the pattern is that you idealize an older male in this case, and then you fall out with them? Is that what
it's almost simultaneous. There's a sense of trying to build that sort of relationship, but also undermine it throughout and find some way to fail it.
Once is so common, but actually happening at the same time is less common because that makes it quite confusing for you, doesn't it?
Oh yes, and that characterizes much of my life. And again, I was only in my mid-40s that it became something I observed in its absence. Once there was no longer any figure like that, it hit me that, oh yeah, no, you're doing this. You've been doing this to yourself all these years, and now it's one of those things where I have to be aware and not put myself in that sort of position when the work dynamic leads to potential relationships like this. But yes, conceivably I could have learned this far earlier and maybe fix this behavior, but
yes. Well, it'll be dealt with at some point, I'm sure. Interestingly, you use the same euphemism as I do for your main career. You call it your day job, with a certain amount.
People correct me and say it's a day career, but I always say day job.
Yeah, and I use that term to describe my work in the music business, and it has a kind of critical aspect to it, that day job, as though the real kind of soulful work happens at night. And I'm sure you feel you're more soulfully attuned to your evening work or whatever you call it than your day job. And I just wonder, how much longer, for economic reasons, do you have to keep the day job going for?
Well, I mean, I see it going pretty much until retirement or death.
But when is retirement?
Well, retirement in America is, basically 3 days before you die.
That's terrible.
I can see it going another. Oh, I know, but that's the lack of a social net we've built here. Well, it's weird because, I could see it going another 20 years. I'd be 70, step down. A friend of mine who holds a similar role, we both run trade associations in this sector of the pharmaceutical world. He's in his 70s and still going along just fine doing this stuff, but knows that,
how many hours a week do you dedicate to your day job?
I'd say it's full time. It's 40 plus hours, but I also leaven that with, again, reading for guests, making art, doing the podcast, on weekends and evenings. Sometimes it'll be a late afternoon podcast session. So I'll just, I work from home. So it's just took care of enough stuff this morning. I'll go into New York and sit down with this person, or I will, getting into the Jungian thing, I will put on a different persona and become the interviewer instead of the trade association / lobbyist guy.
Is it not more authentically you?
I never know. It's one of the big questions that your book has raised for me is whether or not there is an actual self underneath.
There is. Well, Jung would certainly say there is. There is an authentic.
Well, yes, Jung would say that, but it's in my own experience is that question: is there something other than the various? Is there something other than the various facades or personae that I put up to face the world? And is that something that lies underneath just a screaming child who is still traumatized by birth and, the first years of his life? Well, but anyway, that's getting a little deep a little quickly.
Our inner child is always present to some degree, but we hope the outer or the developing mature adult is able to reparent that traumatized child. But in your case, if somebody offered to pay you what you're getting for the day job, you'd give up the day job and do what you're doing at this moment, would you?
Well, this comes up in an interview I did with Simon Doonan a couple of years ago where I told him in a perfect world, this would be my day job, just doing the podcast. And he told me, honey, I know you think that, but you would hate doing this if it was your day job.
I think that's absolute nonsense. I mean,
if I was being paid for this and there were all the exigencies of advertising and making sure you had the right relationships with people, it's like the David Letterman who started out as subverting all of TV and then interviewing a blonde movie star who's kind of dim because she has a new movie coming out that week. That's the transformation one fears, I guess.
It's actually being legislated by some commercial organization who says you've got to interview these people that you knew you're not.
If that was the circumstance of my being able to do this full time, which in a real world
a fear
would be the
you
case.
Have that might not turn into an actuality. I mean, you might be able to maintain a degree of independence and still have a product that was sellable to. Well, I would have thought it was.
Yeah, see, that's my thing. And part of it is fear of failing at selling it. And that's why I just sort of make it, put it out there, push it as best I can, but never try to make a commercial product out of what I'm doing. And again, there's fear of failure tied into that, but also fear of becoming successful and then figuring out I need to keep pushing.
Yeah.
Part of my thing is that some of my favorite episodes are with people who there is no commercial viability for. They're just people who I want to sit down with and have a conversation. And to me, it brings joy to the audience that I've built. It brings joy. The idea that people would pay to advertise on that is a dicier proposition. But the other thing is, as far as the day job goes, it turns out that the job I have helped save the world over the last 2 years. So, it's not one of those things.
That gives you a great sense of fulfillment.
So there's a whole degree to which, my arts friends have always wondered why I was spending my life adjacent to the pharmaceutical contract manufacturing world. And in 2020 through now, it's one of those things like, I know you guys never understood why I was doing what I was doing, but as it turns out, the companies I represent and the relationships I helped build were making the vaccines that wound up saving billions of people's lives. So, there is some beyond the financial reward. There's a sense of fulfillment there too.
Yes. I mean, I feel that we need two parallel careers quite often. I mean, I basically working in the music business, as I have for 46 years, that's a very extrovert activity, and working in as a therapist is a very introverted activity. And I find they go very well together. And I think often maybe the blend of the two activities works very well for you then. But I can see you've now rather sold me the pharmaceutical industry.
My ability to schmooze, which this podcast really highlights, is also integral to what I do at the day job. Those things complement each other perfectly. There are ways that I know how to approach, how to listen, and how to say, I don't have an answer for that, but I can get you the right people who do. And, just put the right people talking to each other. But so, both of these things kind of leverage each other in certain ways.
Do you think there is a kind of evolving process in your nighttime job, if I can use that characterization, that it's changing the whole time because of people you're meeting and opportunities that arise? Do you think It could be.
Oh, I'm a completely different person than I was 10 years ago when I started doing this. And I think a good chunk of that is because of these conversations.
And so by the time you're 60, it might have morphed into a financially rewarding activity in some way that you can't possibly know at the moment.
Right. And I still don't think of things in terms of, I don't think of this in terms of money. I mean, this is I think doing this for love is what allows it and me to keep going and growing.
Right. I mean, psychotherapists in England are paid a lot less than electricians and plumbers. So nobody does it for money. You do it because it's the most satisfactory, privileged work. Which is in a sense what I can see a certain similarity. You have a lot of very intimate conversations with your guests because of the shrewdness of your questioning.
Well, I've had a few where the guest has actually had this felt like a therapy session line at the end, which I take as a positive.
Well,
they might have been implying it bad.
You've asked me all sorts of questions. What was the first question you asked me about?
What I'm going to ask again is, can you not be a psychotherapist around people, or is that the background through which you relate to the world when you're interacting with people?
It's a very interesting question. I've never been asked it before, and it's what I have noticed is that almost all the psychotherapists, including myself, that I know, are married to partners who are very disinterested in psychotherapy and think that their partners, like me, pontificate far too much and make life far too complicated. And I think we all choose partners who don't think much of psychotherapy for good reasons, that actually to get away from the psychotherapeutic model. I mean, my 3 daughters, if I start sort of psychotherapizing somebody in their, which they're listening to, they'll be extremely critical and stop me behaving like that. So perhaps there's a tendency that I surround myself with people who stop me doing it. Mm-hmm. Because life...
Does that build resentment at all? Or is it one of those things where you need that decompression?
Corrective that they provide me with. And and they do not want, if they ask my advice on something, they do not want a piece of psychobabble. And indeed, when I wrote this book, the editor, I had a wonderful editor, and she said, I want no psychobabble, and I don't want any... sort of self-help books. I want something different. And every time the psychobabble cropped up, she kind of culled it. And the same with anything that became kind of self-help.
Yeah, I'll say the book was the opposite in a good way for me. It was self-destruction, reading it and seeing aspects of my own midlifery kind of laid bare in this Jungian schema that you lay out. It's like, oh, yeah, that explains a lot. Okay, that's why I'm going through. It's not, helping me transcend, but at least diagramming some of the structures that I've put up around it.
There's a wonderful book by a monk who became a psychotherapist, which you may know of. It's very popular in this country, called Care of the Soul by Thomas More. Have you heard of it?
I heard of it, but never read it.
Well, basically, what he says is that our culture rather neglects our do you know Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary? Is that a book that's taken?
No, only in the context of midlife. I've read it in your book.
Oh yeah,
but I haven't read it.
He says that the humanity's brain is split into this left brain and right brain propensity, and our entire culture over the last 2,000 years has fallen into a left brain element and a right brain element, and the left brain element has predominated for the past 2,000 years, and it's about pragmatic rationalism and empiricism and a scientific approach, highly rational, and the right brain is intuitive, feral, instinctive, primal, very much to do with getting away from rational pragmatism, and is soulful too. That's where our religious aspects to our nature, our spiritual side lies. And in Care of the Soul, Thomas More is trying to help us find more soulful activities to, as it were, balance against the much more pragmatic, rationalistic things we do in the culture that prefers that approach to life. And it sounds to me as though you have found this soulful activity some years, 10 years ago, in this work you do, and it gives you the necessary balance. Would you say it has a soulful element, your interviews?
Oh yeah, it's
definitely.
This, especially the in-person ones. Just looking at another person's face for an hour of conversation and having each of you see each other without being mediated by screens or anything else, and just forgetting, having sort of everything else drop away around you and getting into that other person. Like I say, it's opened me up immeasurably.
I mean, you would make a very good psychotherapist. There's no question about that. If you still got plenty of time.
Should I take that as a compliment?
Or definitely. I mean, it means you're highly empathetic and insightful. And I don't think good therapists can be trained. They're born, in a way. They need a relatively high level of dysfunctionality in their early life, but an element, a high degree of stability. Well, it sounds like you've got both. And I noticed in your wonderful interview with Clive James that it was so soulful because you were talking to a man on the very edge of eternity, weren't you? He was about to die.
That's yes.
How
that was
long
exactly.
After the interview did he die?
He survived another few years, largely with medicines that were manufactured by the companies I represent in my day job.
Oh, that was very.
Yeah, it's one of those things where my lives tie together like this. He survived a few more years. We stayed a little bit in touch, but it was really just that experience of sitting with someone who was a literary hero of mine, knowing he might be dead in 6 months. I mean, there's one guest who I recorded with out in Ohio. I flew out there to sit down with him. A literature professor who had prostate cancer, thought he had 18 to 24 months left.
Yes.
I thought, let me go out there and sit down with him. He ended up dying 6 months after our session instead of 18 to 24. And it was one of those moments of, I guess, sort of reminding you or me or people in general to do things now. Not to put off this sort of stuff and to actually go out. And that's, again, helped as I've approached midlife and as I got diagnosed with leukemia last year, helped to sort of look at what matters, what doesn't matter. Even when I give, as I gave you before we recorded, a maybe 4-line description of who I am.
Yes.
Boiling that stuff down and realizing all the extraneous things that weren't that important, that still go to make up a life, but aren't as important as a couple of key things you can put down that help give the big picture. So I ask also, just in your recommendation or idea that I could become a psychotherapist, when a mistake is just a mistake versus a parapraxis. Because last week I had a business trip in New York City, which is a drive, not a flying thing, and managed to forget my daily contact lenses and my AirPods, my little the earpod things that go with the iPhone. And I don't know if it was just forgetfulness after not having traveled for a long time, or is it the undermind telling me I'm blind and deaf, and that it was trying to tell me never to leave the house. You're going to forget all of your important things. I just, figure there's things that you just screw up and then things you read too much into. And I just don't know whether to read too much into that particular act of forgetting.
Well, I think you have to wait and to see. I think there's no such thing as a mistake. There's an event or an experience you have, and you never quite know. You know the Chinese farmer story, which is, it's too long for me to tell you here, but that is the idea that mistakes can actually put you in a wonderful position of. Did you read the bit about Wolfgang Pauli and all his mistakes that landed him up with Jung? Pauli was one of the greatest physicists we've ever had. He had this terrible dark side to his nature, and he ended up with Jung. and all those blunders he made as a man in his early 30s, screwing up his career, had the most wonderful consequence. So I think we often, some sort of self-sabotage can often result in this. Again, look up the Chinese farmer story on the internet, on Google, and you'll see you never know until much later. There's a chapter in the last chapter on the book where I use the Pauli Jung work on synchronicity about my thing I call the idea that I call the gravitational field of authentic need, that somehow we set up, when we find an element of our authentic nature, it sets up a kind of gravitational field that brings into your orbit events and meetings with individuals that are exactly what you need at that time to help you with the developmental impulse that's very much to the fore at that moment. I mean, you've got such a interesting issue, what we call, do you know Gregory Bateson, the great anthropologist and psychologist? His idea of the double bind.
It comes up in your section on
the idea
George
that we
Eliot.
have something that we can't really ever see some sort of resolution to. In your case, that you can't really do this work that you love so much because of the financial reality of American commercial life, that you've got to go on working in your day job probably longer. It's been a wonderful thing for you, but it might be the ladder up which you've got up now, and you need to kick the ladder away. And I think when you get to that position, often something out of the blue happens that gives you this opportunity to do the thing you've always wanted to do, and will provide, in your case, the commercial resource to make it possible. That the double bind is something we have to work on for years and years and years. The bit about George Eliot, she suffered from this double bind, and ultimately her bravery at following through with her relationship with George Lewis, which was so denigrated by Victorian society because they couldn't marry, resulted in her producing these great masterpieces, which resulted in her being reconciled with her family and friends, despite her marital sort of
or scandalous social
scandalous
or
relationship. That and there's something about a kind of psychological risk. If we're brave enough, I think psychological courage is much more important than physical courage. And if you take the risk of doing something you've always longed to do, but for one reason or another, life has made it impossible, it works out well. But Providence has a kind of benign quality. I see it again and again and again amongst my clients. And your fear of failure is the thing that, which it is with most of us. We don't do the thing we want to do more than anything else because we're afraid of failing. But if we take the risk of failing, we tend not to. It's very odd, and I can't find anything better than that. The gravitational field of authentic need as the sort of label I put on that repeated experience I see in so many lives, and certainly in mine. That age 50, deciding I'm going to do an 8-year with a family to pay for and so forth. Do this.
Tell me about your secret identity. That other life as a classical music concert promoter.
Yes.
And how you how that became your
well, I started out as a lawyer
for so many years.
I trained to be a barrister, which is a courtroom lawyer in the UK with the wigs and gowns. And
so I was visualizing. I didn't know if I was just stereotyping that.
Yes,
so
no,
good.
That's what a barrister. That's the difference between a barrister and a solicitor. And I was on this kind of this predictable career curve, and I was going to barristers make a lot of money, and it was very much in the sort of upper middle class sector. barristers are all made up of people who've been to public school and then Oxbridge, and then they go into this sort of this tribe, this brotherhood of the elite, and a lot of them become politicians. An awful lot of our prime ministers have been barristers, and I loathed it, quite frankly, from pretty well day one, and I was beginning to earn some money, and my great passion in those days was classical music. I used to spend every night nursing my bruised heart because I didn't want to be a lawyer by going to concerts. And I managed to get this unpaid job for 4 months, working with on a festival with the man who had been the first festival director of the Edinburgh Festival. And he was running a series of festivals. He said, "You can come and I won't pay you, but come and work with me." And that's how I got into the classical music business. And it was a brave step, and it's worked out extraordinarily well. But it's very exhausting being working in the classical music business, because you spend your life going to concerts in the evening after a full day's work, and then having dinners with conductors and soloists. And that was part of the reason I sort of collapsed and got so tired, and I decided I just couldn't go on working at this kind of pace, even though my business was. I had a partnership with an American company called IMG. You heard of that company?
Yeah.
Mark McCormack. I had a joint venture project with his company IMG, and it was working terribly well. And my main job was 95% of all the international orchestras coming to the UK came through my company, which was bankrolled by IMG. But the American work ethic was sort of busy, requiring me to have very little holiday a year, and so I
have no idea what you're talking about.
and in a way, I was a kind of victim of the same economic model that you're a victim of. And I just said, I told them that I could only work 20 hours a week rather than 60 hours a week, and I was going to delegate a lot of the business to junior members of my staff, and I went off to qualify to train and then qualify as a therapist. And you will not find a profession where the work, the pleasure of the work is so great. I don't know anybody who practices psychotherapist who doesn't love their work. It's an immense privilege going through these experiences with these splendid people who come to you. I wrote in my in my acknowledgements, I thank my family and various friends, and then I've finished by saying, "I have, however, learnt most from my clients, to whom I've often wanted to say, 'My turn to pay this week.'" And it's true. I mean, I feel better for every hour I spend with each of my clients, and I do feel I get as much as they do out of it. It's very therapeutic being a therapist. I come away from every hour feeling better from the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I am very careful. I only take on I do about 10 assessments every quarter, and I might take 1 or 2 of the clients. I've got to feel that I could really become completely devoted to this individual. And that reciprocated devotion, I notice I'm using the word devotion because psychotherapists have great problems with the word love, partly because of the erotic nature of it. And that's what my paper and Freud, I mean, the trouble was the early psychotherapists like Jung and Ferencik, and they had affairs regularly with their clients. So Freud put down all these reasons why you could have no emotional engagement with the client. You had to sit out of view. You didn't have to say much. He was so worried that this early effect of this intimate relationship resulted in this in so many early psychotherapists falling in love with their clients and turning it into an erotic experience. And so that's why it became very depersonalized. But in the 60s and onwards, the whole profession has become feminized, and the relational and the intimate is very important. But my goodness, quite rightly, we're very, very careful about any possible erotic intrusion into the work. But I think it makes us very worried about the concept of love, and that's why I find myself using the word devotion.
Yeah. Understood.
But,
Now, and not in the, falling in love or having a relationship with a client, but are there circumstances under which you say this just isn't working? We have to break off this.
No, I think if you picked somebody you don't have that strong connection with, you simply have to be committed to the work. You can't.
Okay.
What you cannot do is replay the rejection they had at a father or mother early on in life.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So in some ways, you've just got to work through it, and that will be perhaps the hour a week, or perhaps you've got two clients like that, where you don't come out feeling as good as you do with the other, all your other clients, and that's an occupational hazard. But I think after 15 years, and as I'm now in my 70s, time is such a precious commodity that I'm very careful who I choose. And what I do is I say to everybody who comes, I never charge for an assessment because I probably won't take them. But I always say to them, I haven't got room for any more clients, but I may have in the future if you want to come. And then I find a good client. I'll find a colleague who's, I think, well suited to their particular needs.
Gotcha. Yeah, I again, never having been in one of those therapeutic relationships, I have no idea. But as you can tell, I would be, not worried constantly about rejection, but I never know. I never know from my own experience whether I would turn it into a performative thing as opposed to once again getting into that authentic self.
You've got to be more confident in the very natural, spontaneous, personal charm you've got. You're going to get on with pretty well everybody, I should think. Unless you take an intense dislike to them. But I think you'd be a very good client as well as a good therapist. Yeah. I was only, when I started training, I was only perhaps a touch older than you, and there were people who were older than me training. You see, the thing is, Hella Adler, my marvelous therapist, she retired from being a therapist at 98 and died at 102. And I in her early 90s, I was going to see her. She'd often fall asleep, but I'd wake her up and say, "Hella, here's the money. I've got to go now." But she had such spirit and experience and such a individuated human being, and so it is a profession that works very well in old age as a practitioner. So let's say you did decide to practice as train as a therapist, you'd be qualified within 5 years, and you'd then have a 40-year career ahead of you if you wanted to. But the thing to say, one of the things about training as a therapist is after your first year, you start seeing clients. You don't get paid for it. But trainee therapists offer a wonderful service because they provide excellent therapy and they're well supervised for people who can't afford therapy. So they're that's a very important resource that most national therapies have. Anyway,
we'll see if I end up making a career shift in the next couple of months. Everyone can blame you. That's.
But you, in a way, you're doing it now in your manner of interviewing. I think.
Oh yeah. I think both of us come away. Both me and the guests I recorded with yesterday had the same thing. Finishing up, that was so different than what I was expecting, and we connected on things that I don't think they were going into this conversation thinking we were going to talk about. So.
Yeah, I think that's what you've been doing inadvertently, and I think often it's people who are very good at providing support for other people. I don't know about you. One of the psychobiographic details of people who become therapists is one of their parents needed a lot of support when they were young, and they very quickly entered most of their relationships where they looked after the other person's need. Did you have a mother who you were concerned about her?
My mother tended to be more, she was the outgoing or the outward facing, caring person who was also critical of certain things. In my life, so much of reckoning with my parents has been acknowledging that my mom was born 1940 in London and my dad was born in 1938 in Bucharest.
Good Lord.
So everything I look at is they dealt with war, rationing. My dad was a refugee, gets to Palestine in 47, and there's a whole not excusing certain parts of their behavior, but understanding where a lot of this stuff was coming from in terms of how disrupted their own lives were. And then what it means to be born in suburban New Jersey in the 1970s and not have any of the privation that either of them went through. It's it's a little weird.
Do you think you had some kind of intuitive knowledge that they'd had really tough lives and that you were there?
Oh, they were explicit about the toughness of aspects of their life. And my mom's side also, parts of her family were in Poland and Ukraine and were wiped out. So we had that drilled into us at a very young age, my brother and I.
And how lucky you were.
That was implied.
Yeah.
We never really got it. It was much
There
more
was
about
also an implication that you were there to make their life easier rather than harder, and you had to behave well and be not selfish.
That's a good question. I think about it in terms of, well, you have family. This is what you're supposed to do, and it's part of why I don't have family or why I haven't had kids myself. And as a whole thing we can get into. But yeah, there's a sense of my father's, for example, if there was ever issues about, whether he was being a good father or not, if my mom criticized him, his line back would be, my father, the kids aren't in jail, so I'm doing a good job. If my brother or I ever complained about, not getting the video game we wanted or something like that as little kids, it was, my father was in a work camp in Bucharest, you can get by without the video game. So there was always the, raising the specter of World War II and or the Holocaust as a inability to bargain or complain about anything else. I'll put it that way.
Was it an implication that the world was a frightening and predatory place?
Oh, yeah. No, we're always raised with, as Jews, you will always be outsiders, no matter where you are. So there was always that sense of even though it only occurred to me this morning as I was writing up questions for this, I live in the house I grew up in. I've been here most of my 51 years.
Yeah.
And it was only this morning I realized my parents were essentially, well, my dad was a refugee.
Yeah.
My mom left England to go to Israel in the 60s and gave up everything and then came to America.
Yeah.
Maybe that sort of drives my desire to stay in one place all this time, go see the world, but always have these roots down here, even though I know I could pull up and run if I have to. So.
I often think that the worst place and the worst time in history to be would have been between the Vistula and the Volga, between 1941 and 1945. And that's where your father was. And that has an incredible impact on generations. Bert Hellinger, this wonderful psychotherapist in Germany who made such an impact on German mental health after the war, he has this constellation theory, and he says, and Jung does too, he writes about it regularly, that actually what we're doing as individuals is we're dealing with issues that our parents and grandparents and even earlier generations weren't able to cope with, and they get fed down the generational ladder, and we get a chance to try and solve the problem that they were facing. And
well, this raises my question of whether having children is that.
Yes.
For my brother, who has 3 daughters and is all the father my father never was, and I don't mean it in an instrumental way, but having a family has helped him, we'll say, correct the childhood that he had. and be a better
That's
father and at
absolutely
least
what happens. Yeah, I mean,
and I haven't done that.
no,
And
but
so
you've
that's
done
that question of,
something
if
else.
you don't do that,
No,
what are the other modes?
but you've done something else which is highly redemptive. I mean,
Mhm.
what you do in your night job,
Yeah.
I mean, it has extraordinary kind of evolutionary process, hasn't it? I mean, how has it developed to this in after a decade to this way? Has it surprised you how it's developed?
Oh yeah, there are people. It's not. It's something I told a friend recently. Don't ask me if I recorded with anyone good lately, because you're just asking whether I've sat down with somebody known or famous. I said, ask me if I've recorded any good conversations, because that's what it really is. It doesn't matter how well known the guest is. Did I have a conversation that was worth having, and did I learn something from it? And yeah, there were years where I chased certain names, and now, there's people on the
Yeah,
dream list still, but that doesn't matter. A number of things don't matter the way they did, especially in the cut between getting
yes.
diagnosed last year and now. But I recognize even over past years, there were degrees that, the great conversation is going to come when you're least expecting it.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the one you put all the pressure on that you have to make a good impression on
Yes.
guest X. So yeah,
You,
there's personal development, and there's ways the show has developed,
yeah,
where
yeah,
the guests
yeah,
will accommodate, or
yes.
the listeners will accommodate
Two
where this goes.
parallel lines of development. But I notice another thing, that similarity between what you do and conducting therapy is I'd studied philosophy at university, and I've always thought actually what therapists are doing with their clients is applied philosophy. One of the statements that we use in psychotherapeutic training is the same as philosophers use in terms of this Socrates' famous dictum that started Western philosophy and psychotherapy: the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think in our work with our clients on a weekly basis, we're doing epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, theology, aesthetics, all these things we're doing that I studied at university. And I think you're doing the same thing. I think you're having a philosophical discussion. I mean, your discussion with Clive James and this discussion is basically epistemological, metaphysical, ethical.
Well, it gets me to the question within your book, the balancing of that and the neurobiology side of
Yeah,
things. And it's
you see,
I'll try and characterize what I'm getting at, but that sense of, beyond all the thought lanes and processes we develop, the fact that there are physiological roots
yeah.
to some of this is I don't want to say reductionist, but
Well,
it's that tension of what the material world did to us and what we make of it, I guess.
but I think the experiential experience, the emotional experience and the neurological experience, they go hand in hand. And of course, Aristotle would have said biology and neuroscience, he didn't have that then, a part of philosophy. And I think it is the sheer arc of psychotherapy where everything is there. Every aspect of life is part of the process, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It's the and that's what I want to listen to some more of your interviews, and I certainly want to listen to the one you mentioned of the man who died 6 months later.
Oh yeah, I'll send you a link to that one.
Yeah.
D.G. Myers, that was special.
Yeah,
Just for the whole gestalt of what we had. Given that, as I joked at the time, if I knew I only had 18 to 24 months left, I'm not sure I'd want to spend an afternoon with me sitting down. But he gave me 2 or 3 hours, and
well,
we did that.
Yeah, there's that quote, isn't there, from Tolstoy when he was having his midlife crisis, saying how he was so fed up with being in his own company the whole time.
Yeah.
And I know that's, but in a way that comes, doesn't it, from a sort of sense of criticism that's inferred and from the parents and gets placed in the psyche as this, and so often when people come for the first time, this inner critic that's bearing down on them. We have to.
Oh, that was another part of your book that, totally resonated with me. That sense of self-criticism when you're
and
relating
it comes
yourself
from the
to someone
parents
else
who just tell you, "Oh, you're such a pain in the arse. Oh, can't you shut up?" And I mean, mothers who are under tremendous stress and have numbers of children, you can understand why they, as the child is tugging at their apron strings, that they're rude and critical, and that gets fixated in the as an inner critic. And basically what I do is, early on, we find that the location of that inner critic and that dislike of the self comes from that parental origin, and then a kind of anger builds up, which is so important, and suddenly the client feels so furious that this inner critic has been injected in them by the parents' criticism of them for year after year. And the anger allows for separation, and as the separation takes place, the inner critic starts to fade.
See, that's the point I got to get to, because I've already gotten the rage and identifying all this stuff in a bunch of respects. But there's that that sense of letting it go, I suppose.
But I find sometimes clients arrive, often in their 50s, and they are like fruit trees with the fruit that's just ready to drop. And in 6 months, you can do a decade's work for somebody who's younger. They're so ready, and they're so close to the range of insights about the things that hold them back and get in the way of fulfillment and well-being and a rewarding existence. And it goes at a rate of knots when you meet that. It's terribly satisfying, and they change their lives quite considerably very quickly.
Let me ask then, in relation to the book, when it comes to women and midlife crises, parsing the midlife crisis from menopause.
Well, that's something I spent a lot of time with my editor discussing that, and
because you mentioned it with Marie Curie, it comes up, and she's the one major female figure.
Basically, it's such a big subject. These books that Notting Hill Editions provide, they can only be 45,000 words.
It's only 140 pages, so I'm not criticizing, but I'm wondering.
It was a key. And actually, I interviewed 20 female therapists about their own menopausal experience and the menopausal experiences of their clients. And what transpired was, it's very interesting that the suicide rate for males in UK is at its highest between the ages of 25 and 28. But for women, the highest rate of suicides comes between 50 and 54, at the key period of menopausal issues. And generally, what I felt the consensus among in the research I did was that the midlife crisis and the physical menopause are actually, in a sense, separate. But if they're on top of each other, it's incredibly challenging. And that, by and large, most of my female therapists said they were desperate to get their clients of that age who were menopausal and in the midlife crisis onto HRT treatment. And if they could manage that, it eased the kind of double whammy of the double impact of both challenges. And we discussed it for ages, and it was just going to take up so much of the book, and there wasn't room for it. So my wonderful editor was a 45-year-old woman, and I trusted her completely. So we went for that option. But of course, there's a problem in what I leave out. I mean,
just wasn't sure as to how much you can pair them apart versus does menopause trigger the midlife crisis
there wasn't a dissenting voice in the view that they are separate, but they overlap and become one. They conflate, and when that happens, it's just too much for people. for women, and that's why HRT. I don't know whether HRT. I don't know. Is it widely used in?
Oh yeah, it's used in the U.S. too.
Yeah, because we were stopped doing it because it was related to breast cancer for a period.
I forget what the risk.
And now that's gone down.
The risk benefit
they
thing
say there's
is.
no correlation between the two. So, but yes, it was probably the hardest decision about what to put in and leave out. But I'm
sure there was also the factor of you being a male writer.
Well, of course, I could only talk about it indirectly, having not. But I mean, there are hormonal changes in the male too, but they're nothing like, of course, what's going on for women.
So when you bring up things that couldn't make it into the book, do you have a sequel or next book in mind?
I'm working on at the moment. Basically, it's developing the idea that that's laid out in the last few paragraphs of the book, that our species is in the middle of a 200-year midlife crisis, and it's using as a metaphor the individual experience of conception and pregnancy and birth, trying to fit that on very much as a metaphor to the last 2,500 years of our history. I mean, and I use the moment of inception as Periclean Athens. I mean, that 80 years dominates our culture even today. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary how just this small group of people, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, I mean, and a number of others, produce this culture that then there's I think it was Ovid who said, the Romans conquered Greece politically, but culturally the Greeks conquered Rome, because the whole of the Roman Empire became Hellenistic in its outlook, and everything was related back to this extraordinary culture. I often feel that the next time that this extraordinary group of people came together in 4th century Athens was with the founding fathers. I mean, I think the idea of having Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, all in the same room is extraordinary, isn't it? And what these and a number of others, what they achieved, and the fact that what they came up with has worked so wonderfully. And of course, it was as in Periclean Athens, it was an exercise in finding a democratic process that worked.
Right.
So
I did this great books program for my master's degree, and there was a degree of just close reading of both the Greeks and the Constitution, and recognizing for all the flaws, there's so much that they forethought.
And of course, there was a central flaw for both of them. Both societies depended on slavery.
Yeah. Even there, depending on how you read the Constitution, you can see them opening the door to end it. They knew they couldn't end it at the time.
Yes.
But they also didn't totally foreclose the possibility of ending slavery. And it's there. It's not super explicit. And it's one of those things where, yes, as a white guy, I'm exerting privilege here and saying, yes, they should have ended slavery much earlier. But yeah, it's they understood. Some of them understood this was not morally right. Well, but we have to build a country first.
That famous line that Benjamin Franklin said to Thomas Jefferson, something like, we're not concerned with emancipation here, we're concerned with constitutional change. Because they wouldn't have achieved union had they decided to bring slavery into it. The South would have gone separated immediately. Yeah. And that thing that Thomas Jefferson said about the fire bell in the night, knowing there would be a terrible eruption in the quite.
And 80 years later, he was born out.
And it wasn't long, was it? I mean, it was about 80 years later.
Yeah, 70. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so,
it's.
I mean, I've heard it was the kind of original sin of the American Constitution. It was just in there, like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Well, we also wiped out the Indian population. I
You
consider
did
it
that as well,
two
yeah.
rotten pillars of
Yeah.
the country. It's based on slavery
Well, I
and
mean, I'm
wiping out
sitting
the
in
natives.
Bath at the moment, and Bath is our most beautiful city. It's a spectacular place, but it's entirely due to slavery that it's sitting here. So we're all have economically benefited as a culture from that that terrible iniquity.
Yeah, in past years, I would play up hey, I'm a first generation American.
Yes,
I came from pogroms and purges, so it's not like I was benefiting. But of course, we were benefiting, and
yeah.
as a guy with white skin, I benefit now. But
Well, and the fact that it's
oh,
still such an issue,
yeah.
It's as live today as it was then, in a different,
Right.
to a different degree.
It's like you say, original sin and that hereditary trauma that carries over generation upon generation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Do you know a wonderful psychotherapeutic theorist called Erickson, who was very big in America in the 60s? He was Viennese.
No.
He trained with Jung and with Freud and analyzed by Anna Freud. Came to America in Anschluss. He was Jewish, and he wrote Childhood and Society. And he basically said Freud missed something very significant. He wasn't concerned. He was only concerned in the individual experience. He wasn't concerned with the cultural, historical, geographic circumstances that the family of the original child finds himself in. And I mean, you're a perfect example of that. That we need to always take into account the historical moment of how the family was at that time. I mean, basically, I was raised by by a woman whose father had post-traumatic stress disorder because he spent 4 years in the Ypres salient and saw terrible things and she married a man, my father, who had post-traumatic stress disorder, but undiagnosed because he was in the Battle of the Atlantic for 5 years. And so the historical experiences of our families, as Erik Erikson says, are just as important as the emotional environment we find ourselves in. So your sort of historical provenance is extraordinarily significant. And I always want to go in with clients into what great-grandparents and grandparents, what they were going on, how they related to the beginning, this terrible 30-year period that went on from 1914 to 1945.
Yeah. Well, after we're done recording, I'll fill you in on how one of my cousins may have sent nuclear secrets from the UK to Israel, but that's a separate, sins of the family sort of thing. But it's a hell of a story too. But but the thing I'm wondering, we talk about, well, the historical moment and, what people are going to be looking at as far as trauma goes from 2 years of lockdowns and pandemic and everything. Yes. How is, and you got a lot of the book done during the pandemic. Yeah. How were you able to do any therapy with patients during this whole experience?
I started off we couldn't see people indoors in our normal practice. So we started off on Zoom, which I hated. You miss so much. Body language and facial expression is so important. So often language, verbal communication is a kind of smoke screen, and all the real information, most authentic information, is in the presence of the person. And very soon I shifted my practice into a local cemetery, and I met with two garden chairs sitting 5 meters apart in this cemetery. It was lovely. And all my clients liked that. And it was fortunately, it was between May and September we did this. But I mean, what the pandemic has done, it was a kind of spasm of national introversion or global introversion, when people didn't escape into their work to avoid and distract themselves from the problems in their life, and the mental health of the nation became quite fragile. And as a result, people, I mean, we've never been busier as a profession. So anything, I think, that gets people into therapy, because I'm a believer in therapy, is a good thing. And if people and so that is that idea of crisis and opportunity going hand in hand. Therapy works 80% of the time. I mean, I do sometimes feel I put my money on roulette wheel red, and even now I might be wrong, and I've got 10, 20 years to go, and I might find that actually I put all my money on the wrong bet. But I don't think I have. I mean, I've just seen too many people benefit from it. And I think we owe Freud and Jung and Winnicott and Klein and all the great theorists an extraordinary debt of gratitude. And they only had anecdotal evidence. They had no hard data. And they made all these suppositions and prognostications about how human beings operated. And now, 100 years later, with MRI scan material and brain autopsies, we now know that they got it right. That the anatomical evidence within the neurological evidence, hard data we have, shows that they got it right. That the fact that the hippocampus, which gives us our sense of well-being, only develops 3 years after birth fully and is operative 3 years after birth. And because the amygdala, our flight and fight response, which makes us so anxious, is fully formed 8 months into 8 months of intrauterine life, means that at the trauma of birth, we have this terrible flooding of adrenaline into our system, and that goes on until the hippocampus starts to work and restrains the adrenaline flow. So the mothers have a tremendously difficult job. They've got to do the role, the neurological role of the hippocampus in those early years. That's why infantile trauma is one of the great building blocks of life. But as I say in the book, that I think evolutionarily we need a certain level of dysfunctionality, drive and ambition and energy are, as it were, propelled by dysfunctionality, providing it's not too great. And we need the tension of the stress of those early traumas to provide great politicians and great painters and great writers and great philosophers. They all had some flaw in their nature that propelled them forward. And my experiences of very well parented people, they live in such a benign, benevolent world. They don't really, they're too relaxed, they're too laid back to make great forward drive, really. And that happens. So there's a kind of evolutionary advantage to have people who are quite driven, but it has to be controlled and, as it were, molded into something that works for the culture, for the. I feel I'm just sort of pontificating too much now.
No. I mean, it's summing up what you get at the finale of the book. That need for, and it raised the question for me of, again, not being a parent. You know, the whole helicopter parenting thing, which I'm sure I would have been had I had children, where you're constantly trying to make sure nothing goes wrong and everything is okay, as opposed to go play in the woods behind the house until dinner time. I'll ring a big bell when it's time to come up, which was my mom's thing. My brother and I and our neighbors would just go into the woods behind the house and go hang out for a couple of hours, play and do crazy stuff. And you hear a bell in the distance. It's time to come running back home and eat.
That sounds rather a healthy, interesting.
Oh, yeah, it was fine. Except if you did that with kids nowadays, you'd be accused of leaving them to be abducted.
What you mean, yes. But I often notice that people who don't have children, they use their paternal or maternal quality in rather a effective way by they kind of project the paternal archetype, and people are attracted by that. And there's something in your interview technique. You're giving the kind of freedom and framework of a good father to the people who are feeling rather nervous. And that I suspect your paternal qualities, they may not be, as it were, being used for actual children, but they're operating almost from day to day. And
I'll take that. You know, that sounds appropriate.
You can see that, can you?
Yeah, I mean, I frame it in different ways, but only because I don't like associating myself with a paternal aspect. But I get where the way you're reading it is probably better from the outside.
Aspect. Obviously you have a negative aspect in the maternal archetype.
Yeah, and my heart has grown colder towards my father in later years.
Is he still alive?
Yes, he is, in a sense. And there are degrees to which I.
So there is a kind of paternal wound there in you.
Oh God, yeah. No, it defines most of my life. Yeah, it's not even something I deny.
But you see, I think in that primal wound, there's a huge gift. As you work with the wound, you see that it provides you with so much of your best intentions and your higher quality, your finer qualities. But it's very odd. That's a strange paradox. But I think so often I feel it in myself. I mean, I had huge problems with my mother and father, and of course what the clients do. But eventually they can see that it was a sort of gift. It formulated within the wound was formulated the very best parts of the life that we live.
Yeah. But I see it as using it to face out at the rest of the world, even if I can't fix what happened in my or how I was bent in my youth. At least I can turn that towards something good like this.
Yeah. You see, what you're offering is, I suspect, I don't know the size of your audience, but I imagine you've had a lot of remarkable conversations, and they may find a way of enlarging that audience. I don't know, in some sort of book or something. I mean,
yeah, that's been mentioned to me as a possibility. It's something I would need time to really put together and figure out how to work, how to excerpt, various shows over the years and figure out, common themes and what I've learned and what these people have to tell us.
How many have you done? How many interviews have you done?
This will be episode 489, which doesn't count and you'll love this one. During the pandemic in the early days, I recorded 60 in 65 days with past guests. Yeah. Remember how fragged we all were?
Yeah.
Around late March, I started doing this with past guests of the show and just said, how are you holding up? What's going on? And we would just do 20 or 30 minutes and I would just post it immediately with no editing. And that lasted for 2 months. And it was one of those things when I look back, I'm like, I have no idea how I had the energy to do that, but we were all running on adrenaline, as you point out, and anxiety.
Well, if you
go on.
If you take your nearly 500 interviews, judging by what I've heard and this interview, and you were selecting the 5% of the best interviews, I mean, that's 25 interviews. I bet you they'd be remarkable.
Well, you know me. Every one of them is the best that I've ever done. So I love all my children equally. I know where you're coming from. 500
children. Yeah, but I mean, you sent me your top 5. I hadn't had a chance to listen to them all, but I suspect there's some remarkable exchanges within those.
Now, every one of them, there's usually a moment where there's a connection where neither of us thought something was going to come. It's not, I do script out some questions, but this is also about listening and learning. And again, you know all this from therapy. There's a degree that somebody will say something unexpected or that they don't realize is going to lead to something more profound about who they are and how they got that way. And I just kind of follow that with them and try to figure out, where they're coming from or what the motive really is, or how they responded to something once upon a time. But
I just wondered whether one of the things I'm very aware of doing this is I have no sense that anybody's going to listen to this. That this seems to
Oh,
be
I
an
always
intimate.
joke. I always say to people, "Don't worry, no one's listening."
Yeah,
Whenever we're
I don't know how.
recording,
I
and
mean,
yeah.
and so the intimacy of the conversation. I think actually, what human beings want more than anything else in life is intimacy. They want to break out of their isolated solitude or loneliness, and they want as much contact and connectivity and relational connection with other human beings. And you would clearly achieve that time and again with all your guests. And I'm sure the sense of performing for an audience, which must instruct them before they start, they've now got to sort of come up with some funny stories once
the exchange starts, they start to figure, or maybe it's just intuitive. They get this is just a guy talking with me. This isn't, forget the microphones or forget the browser we're looking at, and you just, you connect directly with another, we'll say soul, but another person.
Yeah, I do say soul. Exactly. And I think this is about the 12th interview podcast I've done, all from in Australia and various other places. And this is quite unlike any of the other 11. I do think, again, I think you may be doing something that is unique globally. And I
appreciate that.
I think you may underestimate what you've achieved.
Well, I self-deprecate. Deep down, I feel like this is going to be the thing I'm remembered for. And that was, we didn't even go in much into the, how do you respond to getting a leukemia diagnosis? But part of it was...
That's what I just get the impression that you're going to live another 30 years. I don't know why.
Oh, yeah. But in the... and we're running long, so I'll let you off soon.
Yes.
But in the interim of, Gil, you need to go see this oncologist, and that first appointment 10 days later, I went to you have 6 months left, and let's figure out what matters and what doesn't matter and what gets left behind.
Very creative.
And that really crystallized things in my life. And, taught me which things mattered and didn't matter. Even this one guest I was, I'll say dying to get.
Yeah.
I finally pursued and got, and he's somebody who'd been suffering from cancer or had been diagnosed with stage 4 a few years ago, et cetera. No word as to his health. We sat down and I went into it thinking we are going to have this conversation about mortality and art and all this stuff. And it was the last thing he wanted to talk about. And we went off and played miniature golf first at this course that he built. And, we did all this other stuff and had a completely different thing than I was expecting. And I thought, that's what life is. You went in with this whole framework and this culmination and structure, and life just kicked you in the nuts and said, nope, it's going to be completely different and totally rewarding.
Yeah.
You're glad you made the trip anyway.
So did your diagnosis actually coincide with the lockdowns?
No, it was a year later. So this was June, July of 2021. So I'd already been, part of it was I didn't get my physical in June of 2020 because of all the lockdowns. So when I went a year later, they were like, yeah, your blood test looks a little weird. Let's go do another one in a few weeks. And then it was go see an oncologist.
There's a slight collation between the two. I mean, both experiences were very primary experiences, weren't they?
Oh, God. Take turning 50, locking down and avoiding human contact, so no more travel, which dictated a huge chunk of my life for years and years. And then this leukemia thing. And it's like, wow, you kind of force-fed the whole midlife thing, which is why, again, your book resonated really a lot with me.
In some ways, I always think the midlife crisis is the timing of it is characterized by probably the most challenging experience you're ever going to have. And I think a leukemia diagnosis and a pandemic is probably as difficult as it's going to get for you, isn't it?
I would hope. And, life keeps throwing crazier stuff at you. But, I figure, I've retained flexibility in my life. I do these things remotely when I never would have done that before March of 2020. But, it also
you give the
teaches
impression
me
of somebody who's very empowered, is very on top of things. You don't seem to me to be somebody who's buckled under the challenge.
No, I was writing to a long-term friend a couple of days ago about because he finally realized when I explained how I can't do something that he was hoping I was going to do, that he's like, I really didn't realize that all these things that you're doing really are eating up all of your time. I'm like, yeah, I paper over the cracks really well. And, I project this persona. There are moments when I sit and just stare at a wall, but it's
doing nothing
it's
is a
not too
very
much.
underrated activity. I always think doing nothing is a crucial way of behaving.
I refer to it now as unthinking my way out of a problem.
Yeah, very
If I
good, very good. I like that.
unthink for a little while,
Yeah,
it might help.
waiting is
But
so
anyway,
often the best thing. Yeah.
yeah. But I will leave you to your Sunday. The one question I did want to ask, but before I leave off, I was reading a novel last night,
Yeah.
and the narrator mentioned that another character had been reading Jung lately. Should I just take that as a coincidence, or is this again synchronicity in the gravitational field that I should be concerned about?
I think everybody should read Jung, but Jung was that I can't remember who said it. I apologize for how long this is, but I didn't have time to make it shorter. I think it was Lincoln or Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin. It was an American anyway. And he is very long-winded and verbose. And I think you need to read some of the great kind of interpreters of Jung. There's a man called Anthony Stevens, who I think wrote one of the best books on Jung. It's just called On Jung. If you are to read any of Jung, the best thing is his autobiography he wrote, which you probably heard of, Memories, Dreams and Reflections. He wrote it in the last year of his life, and he dictated it to somebody who was a much more eloquent writer than he was. He was not a great writer in the way Freud was. Freud won the Goethe Prize in 1926, I think, and he's a wonderful stylist, where Jung isn't, I'm afraid, but his ideas are so optimistic. I would suggest On Jung by Anthony Stevens, which I'm sure you can get on.
I will expect a reading list from you.
Yeah, well, I will,
soon after we finish.
I'll come up with a few other books, and I look forward to some suggestions from you. At the moment, I'm reading Robert Oppenheimer's Reith Lectures from 1953. Oppenheimer was the most wonderful writer. I'm bowled over by him. He's a polymath of. I mean, I hadn't realized that he knew so much about the arts and philosophy, and not just quantum mechanics and relativity.
I remember him making the that Vedic comment when they blew up the bomb the first time. So I assumed he had some at least comparative religion background.
Yes. No, he's got a man of immense breadth and capacity. Do you know Christopher Nolan, the filmmaker?
Yeah. Just watching a few moments of Memento last night, which I hadn't watched in 20 plus years.
But Interstellar but his current film is on the life of Robert Oppenheimer, and I can't wait.
Oh yeah, that's right. I remember seeing he's cast.
And there's the John Adams opera too, Dr. Atomic. So he's a figure that we're beginning to understand was incredibly significant. Yeah,
and which I'm sure will end up playing into your
well, yes,
next book.
I've definitely. In his opening lecture, the Reith Lectures, I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're the BBC's major lecture series a year, and they're a great honour they get marvellous people to do it, and he wrote them in 53. But he quotes Jefferson continually, who he had a great regard for. He quotes from his letters, and so he's got this incredible range of reference.
We need more polymaths.
He really was a great man who, of course, suffered from an immense ethical double bind, a tremendous dilemma that he'd actually created this terrible weapon, and felt very conflicted by having done it. And then, of course, he was pursued, wasn't he, by the McCarthy witch hunt, wasn't he? And
because when someone expresses doubt, well, this is a Plutarch story of mine.
Yes.
There is a life in Plutarch that, to me, A, should be adapted into a movie. B, is so insanely compelling and fantastic. But when Plutarch compares it to the Roman analog,
Yes.
He finds my favorite to be the wanting of the two, because that character, that historic figure, expresses doubt and has a mental breakdown at one point. Timoleon is the life that I
could you
so
send me the
enjoyed.
reference to that?
Oh yeah, it's a great one. Trust me. It
I'm
is.
afraid what I realize about writing a book is it's actually just serial plagiarism.
Yeah.
You're just borrowing other people's ideas and restating them in a different format so you can camouflage his.
Yeah, and this is why I do it in speech on the show instead of putting anything in writing, because then people will figure out how much I've really just done a pastiche of other people's stuff. So.
But I think that's how you move forward, isn't it? Everybody builds on the you're standing on the shoulders of previous giants, aren't you? I suppose
if you're willing to learn, yeah.
But it's a delicate matter.
Yeah.
So I'm always on the lookout for whose ideas I can steal, whether it be yours or Oppenheimer's. But what about you? I mean, you must have a book in you. I mean, you've got a tremendous range of interest in.
Well, this is the Gil fear of failure thing. I was supposed to be a writer growing up and didn't. And I mean, I write, but how I write is different than putting things in prose. I will send you the
God, I'd love to have you as a client. I mean, you're you are so near shedding that what's preventing you. It is, that there is a perfect example of a complex that's preventing you reaching your prime. But fortunately, our primes happen late in life. You've got bags of time. You will leave that inner critic behind you, I'm quite sure, in the fear of failure.
Well, part of it, and we didn't even get into my making art in the last year and a half.
Yeah, you've done that. I saw your pictures. They were great.
But the great thing about making art is that there was no expectation whatsoever. So anything I did,
so there was no
fine.
You dodged
my life is
failure.
Yeah, my life is based on language, and as such, if I screw up telling a story or how this writing goes, that's a sign that I'm a failure. I screw up drawing a tree. Well, for Christ's sake, Gil's not an artist anyway, and he at least he tried. And so, the problem was I started to get a little better and then put more pressure on myself, and that created all sorts of complexes, which I guess you're right. Okay. But anyway, as far as actually taking on something and learning and getting better with it, I was somehow able to do that at 50 in a field I didn't have real background in, as opposed to the thing that I was supposed to be my destiny all these decades.
You've probably got a great book in you. I mean, it takes us back, doesn't it, to the first inaugural speech by FDR, the famous, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Yeah. And I've done a great job of fearing that for a long time.
Well, we all do. Yeah.
We'll see how well I keep it up.
Well,
after we finish up, I'll get your mailing address. I will send you the one chapbook zine I made during the early pandemic, and you'll see that you're completely wrong and I should never write another word. I'm just kidding. You'll see that I actually did put things together.
You'll take the risk at some point, because you've clearly got a marvelous book in you. And then maybe if you produce the book that then sells very well, you can then leave the day job behind. Although I'm
telling you, I'm saving the world in the day job.
Well,
I feel okay about
it. I mean, that's no bad aim or task in life, saving the world.
Yeah, and it's given me all sorts of great stories, which I'll share with you off mic.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for the day job.
And that was Andrew Jamieson. His new book is Midlife, Humanity's Secret Weapon. It's from Notting Hill Editions, and in the U.S., it's distributed by New York Review Books. As you can tell, I enjoy the heck out of it. It is something I will continue to reflect on and reread, and I hope, find my path through life with or without therapy. Now, Andrew does not have a social media presence as far as I can tell, which we all know is a good thing. I'll have links to the book in the show and episode notes for this one, though. Now, you could support the Virtual Memory Show by telling other people about it. Tell them there's this guy out there doing these podcasts every week with these really interesting and fascinating people you never would have heard of under normal circumstances. You can also just tell me what you like and don't like about the show. Tell me who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me postcards, letters, emails, DMs if we're connected on Twitter and Instagram, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages can only go up to 3 minutes long. It does go directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in an awkward conversation. But yeah, messages can only be 3 minutes long. And so if you're going to go long, call back and leave a second one. And let me know if it's okay to use your message in an upcoming episode of the show. Sometimes callers might have something they want to share with the rest of the audience. I would never do that without the permission of the person leaving the message, but let me know. 973-869-9659. Now, if you've got money or resources to spare, you don't really have to give it to me. Your support really comes through in terms of listening to the show. My finances are fine. The expenses for the show are pretty minimal. So if you do have money or resources to spare, give to individuals or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato.go, and other crowdfunding platforms. If you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank every month. I give to the Poor People's Campaign and various political campaigns, as well as freedom funds. There are election funds, Planned Parenthood, and other things you can contribute to, and ways you can help us try to build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.